They said I wasn't on the list. Not for the seating, not for the mention, not even for the family photo. The invitation to the unit recognition ceremony had gone out to every parent, every spouse, every child of every honoree except one. The email chain passed through my mother's inbox like I didn't exist. My name wasn't whispered at the dinner table. When my brother called to gloat about his ROTC coin, he didn't ask if I was attending, just told me what he was wearing. My silence was the RSVP. I didn't tell them I was going, didn't tell them I'd be seated in the front, didn't tell them that while they polished their excuses, I was being recommended by Joint Command for a citation that doesn't come with applause, but a classified file and a security escort. Sometimes the uniform they mock is the one that will save them. I remember the drive, black SUV, windows sealed, escort in front and behind. No music. Just the dull hum of a comms line and the breath in my chest. Outside, the air buzzed with pre-ceremony tension. Families in coordinated blues and whites, kids holding foam flags, wives with flawless hairdos that matched their husbands' ribbons. I walked past them, alone, saluted twice by officers who didn't look me in the eye but knew my clearance outranked theirs. I walked toward the gate and paused. There they were, my mother in a floral blazer too bright for the occasion. My father with his arms crossed, sunglasses tucked in the collar. My brother laughing with someone from his old squad. None of them saw me. Or maybe they did. Maybe they just didn't want to. Have you ever stood at the gates of your own family's pride and been told you don't belong? Because I have. Not in words, but in omission, in posture, in the way their shoulders didn't turn, their voices didn't drop, their eyes didn't widen. I passed them like wind. They didn't even flinch. I showed my badge to the event staff. They glanced once, straightened immediately, and let me through with a sharp, "Ma'am." I sat in the row reserved for special commendation recipients. It was front left, facing the podium. We didn't wear name tags. We weren't supposed to. Half of us didn't even have real last names on paper. But I knew the man next to me from Riyadh. He lost half his hearing in an explosion I coordinated the evacuation for. He nodded at me, then back at the stage. A brass band played something ceremonial and forgettable. My father loved music like that. He'd always hum those stiff, proud tunes after a baseball game, pretending he'd done something honorable when all he did was shout at referees. When the announcer read his name later, he stood with a satisfied nod, shook hands like he was one of them, a volunteer logistics consultant 4 months embedded during wartime. Not a soldier, but they gave him a plaque. That was enough for him to believe he had been one. He still didn't see me. The event proceeded like a military march, precise, repetitive, familiar, until my name was called. Not the one my family used. Not the nickname they muttered when mocking. Not even the middle name I grew to resent. They called the code name, the operation name, the one tied to encrypted files, cross-border rescues, and black sites that don't officially exist. Lieutenant Commander Aurora. The colonel read aloud, for exemplary conduct, leadership in crisis, and successful completion of high-risk extraction under international duress recognized today by Departmental Order Alpha 3. Silence. It wasn't applause I heard first. It was the absence of movement, the collective pause, the confusion, the turning of heads, eyes darting, searching, and then, slowly, the colonel raised his hand, a formal salute, toward me, toward the one they thought was a ghost. I stood, stepped forward. My boots echoed against the stone floor like a metronome in a cathedral. My eyes stayed ahead. I didn't scan for my family. I didn't look for approval, because I already had it, not from them, but from the people who matter in a room like that. The colonel's voice dropped when I approached. "Hero of the unit," he said, and his tone was different now. Like he'd read more than just the citation, like he knew what it meant to be the one they tried to forget. He handed me a velvet box. No photographers, no claps. Just quiet acknowledgement. It was the kind that meant everything. When I turned to sit back down, I finally let myself look. My mother was frozen. My father blinked. My brother's mouth was slightly open. You know that expression people make when they see something they cannot process. It's not shock. It's vacancy. Like a system error in the eyes. They hadn't planned for this. They hadn't made space for me, because to them, I was always the mistake. The daughter who left. The sister who didn't smile enough. The one who disappeared into black briefcases and classified maps and returned thinner, quieter, unreadable. But I never needed their understanding. I needed my mission, and that part, I never failed. When the event ended, people came to shake my hand, quietly, carefully. Officers from divisions I wasn't supposed to name, a commander whose daughter I saved in a hotel fire that was never declared an incident. Even the defense liaison paused before me and murmured, "We owe you more than this room knows." I smiled once, only once. Then I walked past the refreshment tent where my mother held a glass of champagne too tightly, her fingers white against the stem. She whispered something to my father, but he just stared forward, like he was trying to make sense of a war story that didn't include him. I passed them again, and still, not a word. No apology. No, we're proud. No, we didn't know. Just silence. Have you ever felt more seen in a room full of strangers than you ever did at your own dinner table? I have. And it breaks something inside you, but it also frees you. Because once you stop waiting for their eyes to find you, you can finally open your own. You stop needing to explain why you disappeared. You stop needing to forgive the way they erased you. And you start walking like every step is a sentence in your own story, not theirs. I didn't go back to the car right away. There was a bench near the back of the compound, tucked behind a concrete column and out of view from the ceremony courtyard. I sat there for a long time, medal still in my pocket, boots still wet from the march. The sun was beginning to fall behind the flagpole, casting long shadows that reminded me of maps the kind I used to spread out on briefing tables, pinning down coordinates that would later vanish in ink and silence. You know that feeling, don't you? When you've won, but you're not allowed to celebrate. Not too loud, not too long, because someone might mistake your pride for arrogance, especially if you're a woman in a place where men still measure worth by the weight of their own voices. I didn't cry. Not there. I learned early that tears have timing, and mine never came on cue. The first time they called me a throwaway, I was 15. We were at the kitchen table. My brother had just been accepted into West Point's summer program. My mother was setting down celebratory cake, one of those boxed vanilla mixes she used when she needed something easy. Dad had poured himself bourbon. Neat. Like he always did when he wanted to feel like a man. I was looking over a printout from an ROTC scholarship I'd secretly applied for. I slid it across the table. My father glanced at it once, then laughed. "You in uniform. That's not what we raised you for." And my mother, without even pausing to cut the cake, said, "Sweetheart, you'd never last. You're too sensitive, as if that disqualified me from war, as if empathy couldn't survive beside firepower." I didn't say anything that night. I just watched the frosting drip down the side of the cake and wondered if one day they'd regret laughing. I joined anyway. I enlisted with a name they didn't know, started basic under a different branch than my brother, took assignments that didn't land on news broadcasts. If they had tried to look me up, they wouldn't have found anything. Not because I was hiding, but because some of us operate in places where silence is part of the contract. You know the kind of silence I'm talking about. Not the peaceful kind. Not the quiet after a storm. I mean the erasure. The kind that makes people comfortable because you're not there to contradict their stories. The kind of silence that lets them call you fragile, while you're pulling injured men out of a crumbling embassy compound under sniper fire. They didn't know about the mission in Caracas, about the hostage extraction in the swamps outside Jakarta, about the night I stitched up a child's arm using a field knife and my own trembling fingers. They didn't know about the 3 letters of recommendation I'd received from Special Command, or the way my name, or at least the one I operated under, echoed behind steel doors in secured operations halls. They just knew I didn't come home for Christmas. That was enough to call me a disappointment. I sat on that bench behind the ceremony until the air chilled, until the event was dismantled, until the chairs were folded, the podium packed, the flags untied from their stands. Then I stood, walked slowly toward the lot where families were now hugging, laughing, posing for photos. My family wasn't there. Their car was gone. Of course it was. They'd come to honor the son, not the stranger. They didn't know their son had once called me a burden in front of a girlfriend, that he had told her I was the type of woman who'd probably cry in combat and get someone killed. She laughed when he said that. I remembered it clearly because I had already completed a field rotation by then, and I didn't cry. Not when I had to clean blood off my hands, not when I had to tell a young corporal he wouldn't be able to walk again. I learned how to breathe through horror, how to make decisions while shaking, how to stop associating humanity with softness. That's what they'll never understand, people like my brother, people like my father. That strength isn't the absence of emotion. It's carrying emotion like a weapon, sharpening it, sheathing it, pulling it only when you must. As I crossed the lot, a woman approached me, late 40s, sharp eyes, civilian clothes, but she walked with a gait I recognized. Former officer. No question. Commander Aurora, she asked. I stopped. Yes. She extended her hand. Colonel Vega, Internal Intelligence. We've reviewed your file. Quietly. Of course. There's interest in your trajectory. I said nothing. She smiled, tilting her head slightly. Don't worry. I'm not here to offer anything. Just wanted you to know we see it. Even if they don't. That was the thing about military shadows. Sometimes they reach into rooms your family never enters. Sometimes the recognition comes not with applause, but a nod from someone who knows what it costs to be excellent without being seen. She handed me a card. No rank, just a phone number. Then she walked away. I didn't call it. Not yet. I drove back in silence, past the same billboards that cheered support our troops, but flinched when those troops came home broken. Past the diners and strip malls that never suspected a woman in plain clothes was once responsible for intercepting a rogue detonation near a consulate. Past everything familiar, but no longer mine. And when I reached the house, not my house, theirs, I parked down the block. The lights were on. Laughter spilled from the front windows. They were already toasting. To him. To the son they could claim. To the name that fit their narrative. I didn't knock. I didn't want an apology. Not even a glance. I just stood there for a moment, outside their glowing bubble, and asked myself, have you ever watched your own blood celebrate your absence? Have you ever tasted the ache of being replaced by a version of you they invented softer, quieter, smaller? Because I have, and yet, I don't hate them. Not anymore. Pity is the softer blade. It cuts quieter, leaves no blood, only stillness. I turned away. I didn't need to see what came next. I already knew. One day, maybe soon, maybe years from now, they'd hear my name again. Not from me, but from someone at a conference, a colleague in uniform, a footnote in a briefing they weren't supposed to read. And when that happens, they won't understand the full story. But they'll know one thing for certain. The daughter they called a throwaway was never disposable. It was raining by the time I made it back to base. Not the kind of storm that slams against the windshield like fury, but the slow, steady kind that soaks through your collar, finds your spine, and reminds you that you're alive. I left my jacket in the car. Let the rain hit me. Let it wash away the last flicker of need I had for their validation. You know, people think it's the medals that make it easier. The rank, the clearance level, the tight, hard-earned respect etched in a salute or a nod in the hallway. But none of that fills the hole that opens the first time you hear your own mother say, "We don't talk about her anymore." That sentence. I overheard it once. She was on the phone with her sister, my aunt, the one who used to sneak me chocolate during those unbearable family dinners. I was home on a classified leave, unannounced, 3 days off-grid. I hadn't told anyone I was back because the work had become quieter than I'd ever imagined. My voice didn't belong anywhere anymore. Not in public. Not in family. She was in the kitchen. I had just stepped in, soaked from a 5-hour drive through sleet. My boots still carried sand from an operation I wasn't legally allowed to mention. My hands were shaking from the cold and from the adrenaline withdrawal, and my mother, with her hand around the phone, her voice calm, had said, "No, we don't talk about her anymore. It's just too complicated. Complicated. Not courageous. Not committed. Not extraordinary. Just complicated." As if I were a tax issue, a divorce, a miscalculation. As if my life in the shadows made her dinner parties awkward. I never stepped through the threshold that day. I turned around and left, drove to a motel 2 towns over and sat in silence. That was 4 years ago, and I hadn't been home since. But after the ceremony, after the colonel's salute, after the stares, after the silence, something in me shifted. Not anger, not sorrow, something deeper, heavier, like wet cement setting in the soul. I realized I didn't need home to be a place anymore. It could be a person, a memory, a mission. Sometimes. It was just me standing under rain that didn't ask where I'd been. I walked back to my quarters and peeled off the damp uniform. Laid the medal on the desk like a confession. Its velvet box was still unopened, but the weight of it had already changed something. I took a long shower. Not to feel clean. I'd learned years ago that water doesn't cleanse the kind of grime I carry. But it did allow me to feel again. Just for a minute. The next morning, there was an envelope under my door. No stamp. No name. Just the kind of manila slip used for interagency transfers or informal memos no one wanted to officially acknowledge. Inside a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No signature. Just one line, recommendation approved. Forwarded to command for final review. And beneath that, in smaller ink, a code I recognized. It wasn't for promotion. It was for reassignment. Black level. Permanent rotation. No return. You don't get many chances like that. It meant disappearing. Fully with benefits no civilian would believe. A new identity. A new location. A role that no longer included family reunions or phone calls from cousins asking for favors. The kind of post where the mission was the life. But I paused. Because a voice faint, exhausted asked, "What if this isn't power, but escape?" I sat with that question for a long time. What does it mean to reclaim your story if the final chapter is just disappearance? What if I wasn't meant to vanish? What if I was meant to be seen precisely by the ones who chose not to see me? That's when I knew I wasn't going to disappear. Not yet. Instead, I wrote a letter. It was addressed to my father, but I knew my mother would read it first. She always did. I wrote it by hand deliberately, like a field report or a memory I couldn't afford to misstate. Dear Dad, I was at the ceremony. You didn't see me, but I stood 30 feet from you. The colonel saluted me. I received the highest honor a classified operator can receive in public view. I didn't expect applause. I didn't expect a hug. I only wanted to see if you'd recognize me. You didn't. But that's okay, because recognition has never come from you. It came from the ones I bled for. The ones who called me in at 3 a.m. The ones who trusted me to keep their people alive. That is the only family I ever truly had. I'm not angry. I'm not coming home. But I want you to know something. The daughter you erased is the reason you still get to walk through this country untouched. Sincerely, Commander Aurora P.S. You won't find that name in your files. That's intentional. I sealed the letter in an envelope with no return address, dropped it at a restricted courier. Not to hurt them, not to guilt them, just to give them the one thing they never gave me, the truth. And maybe, one day, they'd sit in that kitchen and read it together. Maybe they'd laugh, or maybe they'd go quiet. Maybe my brother would lean forward, trying to recall what I looked like in uniform. Maybe my mother would cry not from grief, but from the realization that she didn't know her own child. Or maybe they'd do nothing. Maybe they'd put it in a drawer, forget. But I wouldn't, because for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than pain. I felt clarity. Have you ever known exactly who you are? Even when no one else does, I did. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being forgotten, not of being alone, because I knew what they didn't. I was never a throwaway. I was the contingency plan. The envelope was gone the next morning, picked up by a courier I'd never see again. That's how it worked in our world. No receipts, no tracking, no signatures. Just trust that the right hands would feel the weight of your words, or the sting of them. And then silence. But this silence wasn't like theirs. Not the kind that used absence as a blade. This one was clean, controlled. The kind you earn after a mission, when everything is done and no one says thank you, but everyone breathes easier because you existed. That week, I returned to operations. I went back into a building with no name, past reinforced glass, through 3 sets of biometric doors. No one greeted me. That's part of the job. You don't enter to be seen, you enter because they can't do it without you. Inside, a red folder was waiting on my desk. Classified seal, internal signature. I recognized the initials Director MJ, a man I'd met once, at a hangar in Qatar, when I was 27 and running on 2 hours of sleep and someone else's blood still on my sleeves. He didn't speak then, just nodded, as if he knew I'd be back in this room, years later, reading a file that bore his name and mine. The folder wasn't an assignment, it was a briefing. My name had been submitted not for reassignment, but for elevation. I was being considered for unit lead. It wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't decorative, it meant command. It meant men twice my age reporting to me. It meant shaping missions from the inside. No longer just executing orders, but writing the doctrine others would follow. I stared at the paper for a long time. Then I closed it. I didn't need to read it again, because I already knew. This wasn't about reward. It was about reckoning. You see, when you become the thing they swore you never could be, when you surpass even the image they feared, when you step into the room not as a daughter, or sister, or forgotten name, but as an origin point of power, they don't just lose control, they lose the story. And that's irreversible. 3 days later, my mother sent an email. Subject line: "Hi." That was it. Just hi. Inside, 2 sentences. "I saw something online about a ceremony. Was that you? Hope you're safe? It was the kind of message people send when they want credit for asking but aren't ready for the answer. I didn't respond. Instead, I logged into the secure intranet and uploaded the revised command training protocol I'd been crafting in secret for over a year. A new way to teach situational adaptation during capture conditions. My name would be coded, hidden, but it would be there, embedded in the system. Dozens of officers across 5 bases would be trained in something I bled to understand. Legacy doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it hides in muscle memory. Sometimes it survives in the way someone reacts under pressure. Not knowing that the method keeping them alive was designed by the girl her own family discarded. Have you ever realized you've become the architect of someone else's survival? Without them ever knowing your name, I have. And it's enough. But something else happened that week. Something quieter. More haunting. My brother called. I didn't recognize the number. But I answered. Out of instinct. There was static. Then silence. Then. Finally, it's me. I waited. I saw. The footage. He said, his voice breaking like a man realizing the world isn't what he thought it was. From the ceremony. Someone posted a clip. They said your name. My name. The one they never spoke. He continued. Voice lower now. I didn't know. I didn't know any of it. I didn't answer. Because what was there to say? That I'd begged to be seen for years, that I'd swallowed every insult, every dismissal, and turned them into armor, that while he was at happy hour with his squadron, I was lying in the dirt with a fractured rib, dragging intel out of a bunker no one would claim I told everyone you were just in logistics. He added, I didn't know. God. I didn't know. And now, he did. Not because I told him, but because a colonel saluted me in front of a crowd that couldn't deny it. Truth doesn't need repetition. It just needs one undeniable moment. Still, I waited. He said it finally. Quiet. Raw. I'm sorry. I believed him, but I didn't forgive him. Forgiveness is a different language, one that requires time, context, and the willingness to dismantle the entire house of pride you grew up in. And I knew he wasn't ready. Not yet. But I didn't hang up. That was enough. Are you safe? He asked. And something in me wanted to laugh, not out of mockery, but because it was the first time in years he'd used that word about me. Safe. As if I were breakable. As if I hadn't already stood inside the gates of death and come out carrying pieces of people he'd never know. I'm operational, I said instead. He paused. I don't know what that means. It means I'm doing what needs to be done. He exhaled. We said nothing for a while, and then he said something I didn't expect. I tell my daughter about you now. I closed my eyes. She thinks you're a superhero. That's when something cracked in me. Not pain, not bitterness, just release. Because that's all I ever wanted. Deep down, not fame, not medals, not approval. Just to exist in someone's story without being erased. We ended the call not with resolution, but with breath. And sometimes, that's the most honest thing two people can share. That night, I looked in the mirror for a long time. I didn't see a warrior. I didn't see a daughter. I saw a woman who had rewritten her own mythology. One mission at a time, one refusal at a time, one breathless, bone-deep victory no one clapped for. And I didn't need their voices anymore, because mine steady, unbroken, and sharp had finally returned. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of silence again, but not the kind I used to drown in. This time, it was chosen, mapped, structured. Silence like meditation, not exile. I was back in rotation, working tactical response in a conflict zone that didn't exist on any broadcast. We slept in shifts, ate in fragments. Every conversation was filtered through code, but there was something different in the way people looked at me now. not fear that came years ago. This was deeper, like they were following an orbit, one I didn't ask for but now carried anyway. One morning, the junior operative, Rios, barely 23, still shaking when she cleaned her weapon, handed me her comms log without being asked. "I trust you read more than the systems," she said, eyes down but voice steady. "That's how it begins. Not with parades, but with the small gestures of those who've seen what you've done and believe in the things you never say." I led that mission. 5 days behind enemy lines, 6 extractions, 2 lives lost, 1 mine to call, one I couldn't prevent. The kind that stays with you. But I didn't flinch. Not once. When we returned to the fallback base, there was a message waiting. Unmarked envelope. My name in pen, the ink smeared at the edges like someone hesitated. Inside a photograph. Old. Worn. From years back. A family barbecue. My father on a folding chair. Drink in hand. My brother holding a football. My mother in the corner. Watching. And me in the very edge of the frame. Half-cropped. Almost out of sight. Wearing a hoodie and combat boots. 15. Maybe. Silent. No note. Just the photo. I didn't need one. They were trying to pull me back in. Not with words. Not with "we're sorry" or "we were wrong." Just with a memory, the kind that used to hold me hostage. They wanted to remind me who I was before. Or maybe, who they think I still am. But I looked at that girl in the photo, the one on the edge, and I didn't see rejection anymore. I saw the beginning, because that's where I learned to survive. In the quiet corners. On the periphery. Among the people who made me feel like an error in their story. And now I was writing my own. The following day, the commander called me in. Private briefing. Door sealed behind me. "We've received a formal request," he said, "from the defense secretary." I didn't react. "Apparently," he continued, "you made quite an impression at that ceremony. They want you to represent your unit at a civilian military leadership conference next month. Public-facing." I almost laughed. "Me public." He smiled. "I told them you'd hate it, but they insist. It's symbolic." Symbolic. That word again. Because when a woman like me, invisible, overlooked, surgically erased by her own blood, rises to this level, it becomes inconvenient for them not to acknowledge it. I nodded once. When 2 weeks, the flight was discreet. Civilian plane. No insignia. A liaison met me at the airport with a badge that gave no title. The conference hall was in D.C., marble floors, men in tailored suits who still thought they ran the world, women in pearls who didn't know how to pronounce my rank. I walked through them like fog, calm, controlled, forgettable to those who didn't know what I carried, until they read my name from the podium, and once again the shift. Eyes turned. Cameras rose. Some mouthed it aloud. Commander Aurora, hero of the unit. Unsung until now. I walked to the front and took the mic. I didn't prepare remarks. I never do. I spoke the way I operate directly. I come from a family that didn't see me. I began. Murmurs. Shifts in posture. A woman in the 3rd row crossed her legs and lowered her eyes. But I'm not here because they believed in me. I'm here because I did. A pause. Sometimes the greatest missions are the ones where no one is watching, no one is waiting to clap, no one is ready to say your name. I scan the room, and still you do the work. You protect, you endure, you return without fanfare. I leaned slightly toward the mic, and when you do it long enough, quietly enough, with enough precision, the room will eventually turn. A beat. But by then you may not need them to. There was silence. The full kind. Not awkward. not polite, reverent. And in that silence, I breathed for every woman who ever walked into a room knowing she wasn't expected. For every daughter erased, for every name crossed off a list, for every soldier told she was too much, too cold, or not enough. I finished with one sentence. I was never a guest in this world. I built my place in it. Then I stepped back. The applause was late, hesitant at first, but it came. Not from everyone, but from the ones who mattered. A few hours later, backstage, the defense secretary approached me. He extended his hand. "Your father was in ROTC, wasn't he?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. "He wrote us once, years ago, said his son was the one to watch." I didn't reply. He smiled thinly. "Guess he got the name wrong." And then he said it quietly, but with intent. "Thank you, Colonel. Colonel." It hadn't been confirmed. Not yet. But I understood. The motion was in progress. I nodded. "Thank you, sir." He paused. "They'll have to rewrite the briefing bios." "They usually do," I said. Later that night, I got a message from my brother. No greeting. Just a screenshot, a tweet, a photo of me on the stage, captioned, "She's the real deal. I didn't even know." And under it, his comment, "She was always this. We just didn't look." I stared at that message for a long time, not because it healed anything, but because it proved something. Visibility is power, even when it comes late, even when it doesn't come from the people who should have seen you first. You rise anyway. You stand anyway. You become undeniable not because you want them to applaud, but because the silence around you has no choice but to break. 2 days after the conference, I returned to base. The halls were the same steel, sterile, whisper quiet, but I wasn't. Something had shifted. It wasn't visible. It wasn't even something you could describe. But when I walked past the ops room, a captain I barely knew stood a little straighter. When I gave a nod, others returned it with the weight of recognition, not obligation, not fear, respect. Not the kind you demand, the kind you become. That night, in the privacy of my quarters, I unpacked the conference kit they gave me. Inside a commemorative plaque, the transcript of my speech, a formal thank you from the secretary's office. On top of the pile, someone had slipped a photo the official stage shot. I was standing at the mic, back straight, face unreadable, but in the background blurred. Barely noticeable was the audience. And there, in the 4th row, center left, frozen in the act of standing, was my father, not clapping, not smiling, just standing, looking up at me. I didn't know he was there. No one told me. He hadn't called, hadn't sent a message, not even a forwarded link. But he was there. And that image, not the applause, not the lights, that image stayed with me, because it meant he had seen what I had become, not from a family room, not through someone else's summary, but with his own eyes. Maybe he came out of guilt, maybe curiosity, or maybe, just maybe, to finally understand what he had erased. Have you ever realized someone had to see you from a distance to finally understand your worth? I have, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt calm. No fire. No sting. Just stillness. Like the wind had finally shifted in a direction I no longer needed. I put the photo in my drawer, face down. I didn't need to display it. I didn't need to tell anyone. Some victories are too sacred to parade. They live in the quiet knowledge that you were right to keep going even when no one asked you to. The next week was operations heavy. Debriefs, new field assignments, emergency extractions. The kind of rhythm that reminds you your rank isn't armor, it's accountability. Every decision I made now sent ripples through more lives than I could count. Every mistake had weight. I didn't flinch. I've never flinched. But on the third night of that cycle, something unexpected happened. A knock on my door. Protocol doesn't allow for unannounced visits. But this wasn't protocol. It was my mother, civilian clothes. No badge. Just a look on her face I hadn't seen since childhood before the silence. Before the dividing lines were drawn in our house like borders no one was allowed to cross. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me. And I saw it then, not pride, not relief, but confusion. Like she was trying to connect the woman in front of her with the girl she left off every invitation list. "I didn't think you'd come," I said. "I almost didn't." She replied. I waited. She stepped in slowly, hands clasped, unsure of her place. She glanced at the photo on my desk, not the one from the conference, but one of my unit, standing on a rooftop after a night op, faces caked with dirt and firelight. "You always looked out of place in those family photos," she whispered. I said nothing. She continued. "I think that's because you didn't belong to us." And for a moment, a fragile, dangerous moment, I thought she'd say something cruel. But then she added, "You never belonged in that small, petty story we tried to keep you in. You were bigger." It wasn't an apology, but it was something, maybe the closest she could come to honesty. I came to say, her voice cracked, "I saw what you did. I watched the ceremony. I read the transcript. You didn't stutter. You didn't look down once. You were more composed than I've ever been in my life." I kept still. "I didn't understand you," she said, "and I think I punished you for it. Quietly. Without even knowing." The silence between us sat heavy. Then I asked, softly, "Do you know what it feels like? To be the only name not called." She looked down. "I do now." We stood there for a long time, not speaking. And maybe that was the first time our silence wasn't a weapon. I didn't hug her. She didn't cry. But she placed something on the table, a box. Unmarked. Simple. Inside an old notebook. My first journal. From when I was 13. I found it when cleaning out the attic. She said, "You used to write about space, planets, escape pods, codes." I smiled. "I should have known then," she added. "You weren't trying to run away. You were training to launch." That made something tighten in my chest. She left without another word, and when the door closed, I opened that notebook. Inside, scribbled in pencil, was a passage I'd written on the back page. "One day, I will be in a place no one can erase. I will wear silence like armor. I will become someone they cannot forget even if they never knew me." I traced the words with my fingers. I didn't know then what I would become, but somehow, I did. The next morning, my promotion came through. It was discreet. Of course. One line on the secure terminal, confirmed Colonel Aurora, effective immediately. There was no ceremony, no family in the audience, no speech. But when I walked into the command room later that day, the officers stood, all of them. No one said a word. But I didn't need words. I just stood there, calm, whole, unshakable, because I remembered the girl who once sat on the floor of her bedroom, dreaming of being anything but forgotten. And now, no one would ever forget. The day I became colonel, I didn't wear makeup. Not because I forgot. Not because I didn't care. But because I didn't need to alter a single line of my face to know I'd earned it. My skin bore everything it needed, scars that didn't show, tension that never left, and a stillness that only comes from fighting through storms no one else hears. My uniform was pressed, buttons exact, nameplate centered. There were no flowers, no champagne, no glass podium. Just my footsteps down the corridor and a room full of people who stood when I entered because rank doesn't ask for respect. It commands it. Quietly. After the promotion was uploaded to the chain, I received 6 messages. None from my family. I didn't expect them. Instead, a transmission from Kabul, encrypted but unmistakable, the voice of an interpreter I once pulled from a collapsing safe house. I heard. They got it right. Then from Rios, ma'am. You made me believe there's a way through. Another from a captain in intel, permission to mirror your field training protocol for our next cohort. And one that stopped me cold, a private ping from someone labeled only J. Temple. It read, Colonel. We've watched in silence because that's how the best move, but sometimes silence becomes erasure. That won't happen to you. Recommend you prepare for elevation and not just within these walls. We'll be in touch. Respectfully, Temple Elevation. It didn't mean medals or magazine covers. It meant something else. A shift I couldn't yet see, but had felt coming like distant thunder. And yet what haunted me that night wasn't the message. It was a memory. Of a moment I hadn't thought about in years. I was 10. Sitting at a family dinner I was too quiet to belong to. My brother had spilled juice on the table. My mother laughed. My father made a joke about how boys break things. Then he looked at me silent, neat, unnoticed, and said, "And girls just sit there, don't they?" Everyone laughed. I did too. But inside, something cracked. It wasn't the insult. It was the framing. As if invisibility was my role. That night, I sat on the floor of my room and wrote my name over and over on a sheet of paper until the letters blurred. Because I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to take up space. Now, decades later, I did. Not with volume, not with rebellion, but with proof. That's the cruel miracle of time. It turned silence into stone, and I had built a fortress. 3 weeks after the promotion, I returned to my hometown. Not for them. For me. I wore civilian clothes. No badge. No rank. Just a deep green coat and boots made for standing in one place too long. I walked past the school they said I'd never make it out of. Past the gym where my brother once flexed for crowds while I sat alone in the bleachers. Past the house. The one where my name was scratched out of mailboxes. Where I learned how to disappear between kitchen counters and the hum of television shows that didn't include girls like me. I didn't go in. I just stood outside the gate. The porch light flicked on, and there she was, my mother, older, smaller, holding a teacup with both hands like it might slip. She stepped out slowly, saw me, stilled. I didn't wave. She didn't speak. But for a moment, we understood each other. She knew now. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that the daughter she called too cold, too distant, too unfit for dinner conversations had become something permanent. She put down the cup, walked to the edge of the porch, and just stood there. Then, with both hands, slowly she straightened her spine and nodded. A full, quiet nod. Not an apology, not a salute. Something older, something softer. A surrender. I nodded back. Then I turned. The last thing I saw was her silhouette framed by the doorway, unmoving, like a statue mourning the time she'd never get back. I walked back to the rental car, hands steady, and I whispered, more to myself than anyone, I don't need you to respect me. The world already does. 2 months later, I stood in a secured room underneath a base no one talks about, flanked by 2 officials whose titles don't fit on paper. They handed me a folder. Inside a new directive. Top tier. Joint Task Force. Global Authority. My call sign. Intact. But the label was different now. Lead Strategist. Above it, in black ink, Operation Erased, now commanded by the woman who wasn't. I laughed when I read it. Not loud. Just enough. Because the girl they tried to forget was now writing their doctrine. I signed the order, stepped back, and when they asked if I had any questions, I said only this: Do they still think I was a throwaway? The man across from me blinked, then replied, low and certain, no. They call you the backbone, and I stood taller, because I knew the truth. They'd never see me the same way again. Not my family, not my commanders, not the world. And I no longer needed to be anything but exactly who I was. Because power isn't given. It isn't owed. It isn't inherited. It's taken, quietly, over years, through proof, through footsteps that never falter, through missions that rewrite the memory of who you used to be. And I was never on their list. But now, I am on history's.